Hi. So welcome to the first ever Efcca patient talk. We are delighted to be joined by Monica Diaz, who is the Policy and Crisis Coordinating Officer of the EMA, and Piera Polidori, who is the Director of Professional Development, European Association of Hospital Pharmacists. And also from a patient perspective, from Veronika Ivančíková, is the President of the Slovak Crohn's Club. And for our first ever Efcca patient talks, we are delighted to be joined by you all equally as well. So I suppose maybe I'll ask the first question, if I may, and we can take it from there. I suppose the forefront of everybody's mind at the moment is COVID-19. And I suppose the theme of our talk today was, are we running out of medicines? And I'm sure we could probably all talk about that for many an hour, and many of a concern, are we running out of medicines? But I suppose if I ask you, Monica, you have been closely monitoring the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the human medicine supply within the EU, and you've put measures in place to help prevent and migrate the possible distribution to the supply flow. Why have you taken a central role? And I suppose, in your view and in your opinion, what are the main reasons for the disruption of the supply chain?
Thank you, Ciara, and good afternoon to you all. So before I start answering to your question, perhaps it's important to give a little bit background how we manage shortages in the EU, and also to say that shortages of medicines is not an issue that started with COVID. It was already there before, and improving availability of medicines was always a key priority for the European Medicines Regulatory Network. Now, also, we have to bear in mind that it is true that in the EU, most medicine shortages are dealt at national level by the national competent authorities. But already in December 2016, we established the EMA task force on availability of authorized medicines. And this task force was established in order to provide a strategic support and advice to how to tackle supply disruptions for medicines and ensure that they are continuously available for patients. And one of the outputs of this task force was actually to establish a single point of contact network in the EU to share information on shortages between member states, the European Commission, and EMA. Also, this network shares information about alternative medicines that may be available in other member states. But now the question you asked me is why did we have to play an even more important role in coordinating shortages during the COVID? I guess this started a little bit before with Brexit, where the agency has also a pivotal role there in an attempt to prevent shortages when Brexit was to happen, and we had several delays. But if those delays had not happened and we had a no-deal scenario, we would have been in a situation where potentially we would be faced with shortages of medicines in the EU. So we had already a pivotal role there. And when COVID started, we felt that we had to continue that work. And we did so. So the agency has gone really beyond its legal remit and initiated a number of activities. So I think it's perhaps important as well that you understand what the agency has done. So we started by setting up what we call the EU Executive Steering Group on Shortages of Medicines Caused by Major Events. And it's a group that meets every week, also with industry associations. And I'll give you a little bit more detail on the EU Executive Steering Group. We also launched a survey to all MAHs for all centrally authorized products, this in March, to establish the impact of COVID pandemic on the availability of caps. So this was when the situation was very much still in China, and we wanted to see what was the impact for caps. But then, of course, the situation deteriorated considerably in Europe as well. And what we did as well, and this was later in April, we launched the iSPOC system. So not a SPOC. So now we have two SPOCs, the USPOC network and the iSPOC. So this is an industry single point of contact that was established so that EMA receives information about shortages of a set of medicines used for COVID patients, in particular in the ICU setting. And this was a way to receive quick information from pharmaceutical companies on shortages of these medicines. So we had a number of initiatives in place in order to deal with shortages. But I think an important one is what I mentioned already, the EU Executive Steering Group that was set up in order to provide strategic leadership and for any urgent or coordinated action that was needed to prevent or mitigate supply disruptions within the EU during the pandemic. It is a group that consists of representatives from EMA, at the highest level, from the European Commission and from heads of medicines agencies. So we had 7 heads of medicines agencies also as part of the steering group, as well as the CMDH and the CMDV. So this group covers both human and veterinary medicines, but of course the focus has very much been on human medicines. We also have risk communication specialists because we know how important it is communication in a crisis situation. The group was chaired by the European Commission. And as I mentioned, we meet regularly as well with industry associations. So there were very initiatives that started and many topics that were discussed within the EU Executive Steering Group. But I can say that one of the outputs of this group was to publish regulatory flexibilities in the form of question and answers to help industry deal with the situation during the crisis, to help prevent and mitigate shortages by allowing having additional regulatory flexibility. So very quickly, these regulatory flexibilities were issued, and they were updated as well as and when we found it necessary to add additional, let's say, additional flexibilities in order to prevent shortages during the pandemic. And the feedback that we have from pharmaceutical industries that has actually helped them very much in preventing shortages during the crisis. So this is in a nutshell what we've done during the pandemic. Now, you've asked me as well, in my opinion, what are the root causes of shortages?
Yes, yeah.
So we know that shortages are a multifactorial problem, and there's not one single solution to address shortages. If I focus a little bit on the actual pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, we know that the increased demand for medicines that were used to treat COVID patients, that was one of the reasons for the shortage that we experienced, but also temporary lockdowns of manufacturing sites, both in China, India, and as well as in Europe, the travel restrictions that impacted on exports of medicines, also export bans that were imposed not only within Europe, but also outside Europe, for instance, in India, where they imposed an export ban for 14 different APIs, and also stockpiling that was driven by consumers, stockpiling at the level of hospitals and by member states. So we know that also had an impact. Now, in terms of shortages outside the COVID pandemic, there we know that there are many reasons for the shortages, but we need to have a full understanding of what are the root causes of shortages. And in that context, the European Commission is launching a study to understand and identify what are the root causes of shortages in Europe. The FDA has already done such study. We had that information. According to the situation in the US, the shortages there are primarily caused by quality issues, so manufacturing problems. But we need to understand if that is also the situation in Europe, because we have a completely different setup compared to the United States, with a single market, with the different member states. So we need to understand, because only when we understand what are the root causes, then we can see how we can address and prevent or mitigate shortages from occurring. So this is something that is going to be launched by the European Commission, and is really timely that we get this information and a good insight on what are the root causes of shortages.
Yeah, okay. That was, I think everybody will agree, that was a complex answer, and I know I've written some points, but I won't hit you with them just yet, Monica. But I suppose I want to come back to one or two of those points if we have time. And I suppose, Piera, when you look at it, in a recently released report on the medicine shortages, EAHP's 2019 report shows that more and more patients are suffering a deterioration in their health status. as they cannot receive the prescribed medicines promptly, creating a serious public health risk within Europe. We assume, maybe we're right or wrong to assume, but we assume that with COVID-19, the pandemic, the situation has even gotten worse. And I suppose with your findings, what are the main reasons for the shortages in hospitals? And is it a Europe-wide problem, or is it more a national problem? And what are some of the possible solutions to address this problem at both levels as well, at both the European level and a national level?
Yeah, I can speak about my experience in Italy. In Italy, the price of the drugs are very cheap, so it's very easy that there is a large exportation of the drugs, and this is a cause of shortages. During the pandemic situation, of course, the shortages was caused by the large consumption of some specific drugs used in intensive care units, especially the anesthetic drugs and the muscle relaxant drugs and so on. And also because the pharmaceutical industry was not able to cover this large consumption that was at international level, so it was impossible to cover it. And then, as Monica told before, a big problem was the lockdown and because many APR are produced in China. For example, at the moment we have a shortage of heparin for two main reasons. First of all, because the production in China was reduced for the COVID situation. And in the second time, because there was the swine fever in the pigs in China. So for these two reasons, the production was reduced. And considering that China was the only distributor of the principal active, at the moment the shortage is very important. And this situation was the same that happened several years ago. So for this reason, our suggestion is to implement the production of API in Europe. So because if we have more distributors of API and the production directly in EU, in case of lockdown, the shortage can be avoided. Other solution that we have in place that are, for example, the hospital pharmacists try to cover some shortages, compounding some drugs using the API, not the medicine. And in this way, we were able to cover some shortages, but this is possible only for simple drugs, as for generic drugs, for tablets. This is not possible to do for biological drugs that have a very complex process of production. Also, in my country, for example, the pharmaceutical and military pharmaceutical industries helped a lot. Healthcare system producing some drugs that were not available, but in the same way, it's in the military pharmaceutical industries can cover only simple production of simple drugs, not for the biological drugs. So the solution can be...
Yeah. What is this? Do you find, Piera, sorry, is it a national problem or is it a European problem?
I think it's a European problem because the API are not available in Europe, but in some countries there are some specific problems, as my country in Italy, in which for the very cheap price there is a large exportation and shortages are a little bit higher caused this exportation. For this reason, EFCA, that is our regulatory agencies, establish a rule that in case of shortages, the exportation is forbidden.
Okay.
And I think other countries decide this solution. If I can suggest something to the patient, for sure, my suggestion is to get their medicine 15 days in advance before they finishing, because they can understand in advance if there is a shortages, and they can go as soon as possible to the specialist and ask a possible substitution or an alternative medicine. So this is very important. I work very closely to the patient, and our effort is in inform very well the patient, and we communicate the shortages, especially with outpatient that need to take some drug at hospital setting. I think a big problem is also the communication, because we need to have a very good communication, because we need to know in advance that there is a shortage, not when the shortage is in place. Although many regulatory agencies and the EMA too have a very good website in which there are all the information about drug shortages, the pharmaceutical industry are not doesn't communicate very quickly shortages. In many cases, we know about shortages when we don't receive the drugs, and this is not acceptable.
Yeah, I don't know about Veronika, but the first time I have come across a shortage of medication was with COVID-19. But I think your advice is very good, Piera, because usually I leave it till the last week to order my medication. And with COVID, they said to me, look, you need to order it 2 weeks in advance just to be safe. But I think it made me realize that there can be a shortage. And I know here in Ireland, I presume there is not going to be a shortage of medication. So, Nika, I think you have a question as well.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the word and space. So I would like to welcome also from Slovakia all people who are watching this, and also you, our very important guests. Yes, so regarding IBD patients, so in some countries, IBD patients have been given subcutaneous biosimilars, so instead of infusions, in order to avoid hospital visits of elderly patients of over 70. However, this change has some impact from a clinical and pharmaceutical viewpoint. So therefore, I have questions for both of you, Monica and Piera. So first of all, Monica, how is European Medicine Agency considering the approval and introduction of these medicines during the pandemic context? And for Piera, so what is European Association of Hospital Pharmacists' viewpoint on this issue? So maybe Monica, please.
Thank you. Then I will start. So we have not received any such request. So this would have to be initiated by the pharmaceutical company if they wish to have in their authorization, in the marketing authorization, a new pharmaceutical form. And then there's a regulatory procedure to register that new pharmaceutical form. This is, I assume, that you are referring in the cases where that pharmaceutical form is not yet authorized, is not in the authorization. So that there is a procedure which is called a line extension, and that the dossier, so the submission is evaluated by the regulators, and then of course that is authorized. That new pharmaceutical form is or not authorized based, of course, as always, based on the benefit risk of that particular new pharmaceutical form. Now we've not had any such requests during the COVID. We have a process in place to facilitate and to accelerate the procedures in the context of COVID to prevent shortages or to facilitate such situations. So that would something that if we were to receive a request to have, let's say, an accelerated procedure, that we would of course take that into consideration, and based of course on availability of the the assessors to assess the procedure in a shorter time frame, of course we will do that, because we understand the situation that patients may not be able or may not want to go to hospitals to have their treatment, and if they can do that in a home setting, that would be beneficial. I think beneficial for the hospitals as well as for the patients. So we understand that situation, and of course we would act upon that should we be put that request by a pharmaceutical company, but it's not something that we can do ourselves. So there has to be driven by the marketing authorization holder.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Piera, please, what is the viewpoint of European Association of
My viewpoint is that in this situation, it's very important to have a fast process for the approval of some drugs in different formulation to avoid that the patient need to come in hospital setting and a high risk of infection, especially for patients that receive biological drugs can be or cortisons that can be immunosuppressed. So I think this was a very good solution, but it's very important that this approval and is completed with a very good publication, because we need to guarantee the patient safety. So I know that the EMA process is very strong, that they didn't approve a drug in case it's not safe for the patient. But in this way, we need to strongly monitor also these drugs in the post-marketing authorization to understand if there are problems of efficacy, of safety, of pharmacovigilance, and so on, because due to the fast process, it's important to have a very close monitoring of these drugs.
Thank you. I have another question, probably again for both of you. So what do you think, what role do you think patient associations could take in order to improve the situation? So Monica, maybe you can answer the question.
Yes, perhaps I should start. I think we as an agency, we encourage patients and their organizations to play a very active role in preventing or mitigating shortages. And in the context of the work of the task force I was mentioning, the EMA task force on availability of authorized medicines, the PCWP and HCPCWP, so the Patient and Consumers Working Party, as well as the Healthcare Professionals Working Party members, have been actively involved in drafting of a concept paper that the task force is now developing on best practices for stakeholders to prevent shortages. So we are engaging actively with the members of these working parties to agree and discuss what should be the key recommendations in this area. And this is in early stages, but it will be finalized by the end of this year. So we know that Efcca are members of the EDP and EPF, and EPF are members and co-chair of the Patient Consumers Working Party. So you can receive information via the EPF, and also you can receive information on any developments that come out of the EMA task force. And of course, this also applies to any suggestions, any recommendations in relation to this concept paper on prevention. So if you have any ideas on how the role of patients, that will be taken into account, as I mentioned, in this concept paper that is being developed. So also, in addition, of course, it's very important that patients and the members of the patients associations report shortages and issues in their area, and there are existing processes to do so at national level. So we encourage you to report shortages when you are faced with those shortages. Now, we know that early communication is very important to ensure that stakeholders are prepared to take actions to mitigate the impact of the shortages. And for that purposes, last year the task force published a guidance that lays out principles and examples on good practices for communicating on shortages to the public, and also patients and healthcare professionals. So we think that this is a very important part. With communication with patients is very important, and we've developed catalogs. We have EMA's catalog on shortages, and also national competent authorities have also catalogs on shortages that patients can access to. But I would like to stress the importance of the reporting and the importance to being involved in the activities of our task force, and there are channels to do so, and there are ways for patients to be involved.
I'm happy for this answer. Thank you very much. And what about Piera? What about your recommendations or your?
Patient organizations are very active, but I think that they can collaborate with the IBD specialists, for example, scientific association, establish in advance the level of substitution of the drugs used for these pathologies. I think the patient organization can be very active in establish a good communication process for drug shortages. That is very important. In my experience, I receive a lot of calls from the patient that are not aware about shortages and they don't know what they can do. Many times we support the patient giving the drugs, but because in Italy we can give for free the drugs, in other countries not possible. So it's very important the level of communication, and then establish some guideline to protect the patient from COVID infection. For example, limit the contact with healthcare facility to not deferrable situation, to avoid exposure to the virus, and establish some guideline for a good communication between the patient and the physician. During this COVID period, the communication between patient and physician become more virtual because it was impossible the contact. In this situation, it's very important to have a very short but effective communication. So it's very important to explain to the patient, to be very concise, but very to give very important information to the physician. So in this way, they can receive good information because they are able to make the good questions.
Thank you very much. So yeah, the communication is important, and then all sources how to improve the situation and how patient organization in many countries can help to help the situation is important. Thank you very much. From my side for now, it's everything. So maybe Ciara, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do. I have a question, I suppose, as you were both speaking, and I think Piera, when you spoke about the drugs, and in Italy, there's obviously a certain amount of drugs that are free. Is there any fear that in Europe as a whole, that because of the potential economic problems post-COVID, that countries may start choosing different medication as their main supplier, so that to help with the economic situation?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and thank you for asking. Before the pandemic situation, there was a very big concern about the sustainability of the healthcare system, especially for very expensive therapies. After this pandemic situation, of course, we are living a very terrible economic period. So my expectation that the drug costs will increase because will increase the API, the transport, everything. So, and this increase of the cost can produce a reduction of the access to the therapy. Of course, this is a big concern.
Monica, do you agree, or do you think the same might happen?
I think I can perhaps address the situation with COVID. I think with the treatment of COVID patients, I think what European Commission and EMA and national competent authorities are trying to do is to ensure that there will be sufficient medicine for patients. And this is because the pandemic is affecting the entire world. So we have just yesterday approved remdesivir, conditional marketing authorization for remdesivir. But of course, the question will be, how are we going to make remdesivir then available for patients in Europe? Because there will be, of course, competition with the United States, competition with other parts of the world, and it is important that the drug reaches patients around the globe. So that will be that we are discussing within the EU Executive Steering Group what are the ways we can ensure that we can increase production capacity for pharmaceutical companies to make sure that these medicines will be made available. And more importantly as well is even the vaccination. So how we ensure that once we have a vaccine available for COVID, that there will be sufficient there for vaccination of the population, starting perhaps with those more at risk, but then we have to extend that to the entire population. And again, here we're talking about Europe, the United States, South America, the entire globe, and it's important that we have vaccination throughout the world for us to be able to control the pandemic. So here, I think needs to be a joint effort, and in Europe, we're seeing that. We're seeing European countries joining forces together, and the European Commission taking the lead in that respect, making sure that we are already funding pharmaceutical companies that are developing vaccines at an early stage, so that we can then somehow influence the production capacity and can increase production capacity to meet the demand, which is going to be enormous. So that's perhaps what I can add in specifically in relation to COVID.
Okay, Nika, I think you have a question.
Yeah, when Monica, you are talking now about the vaccination, so also for us, IBD community, we are still thinking about that we are somehow afraid of vaccines for IBD patients. I don't know if you are able to answer or not, but is it safe for IBD patients to take those vaccines and to cope with our disease? I don't know if you are able to answer or not.
Well, we don't have a vaccine yet.
I know.
So
we have.
the trials are starting. We hope to have a vaccine that comes out quite soon. But we've published information in relation to the average timelines, and bear in mind, please, that for the particular case of COVID, we are accelerating tremendously the whole process. But we need to have the submission by the pharmaceutical companies once they are ready, once they have the results of the clinical trials. And I think that is going to be taken into account as it is for all other vaccines and all other medications. So it's part of the benefit risk assessment that is done by regulators. And as Piera mentioned, this is a very thorough assessment, and the European Medicines Agency is not going to cut corners. Is going to ensure that the assessment continues to be robust. That I can assure you that the assessment of these vaccines will be extremely robust, as it always is, and it will not change for COVID. We might accelerate the process, so facilitate the timelines as much as we can, based, of course, on the resources, and giving priority for these vaccines. But we will ensure that the assessment will continue as has been always very robust.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes.
This is very important. In general, all the vaccines are suggested in immunodepressed patients because they need to be very well covered by the risk of infection. I think in this way, the Patient Association can be the promoter of an observational study, post-marketing study in, for example, IBD patients, to understand the safety in this subpopulation of patients.
So sorry, now I think Maria and myself, we have lost our chins. We have a question from I think she's in Italy. Where can I obtain additional information?
So perhaps I can start. So if you want specific information on drug shortages that are now ongoing in the different member states, you can look at the shortage catalog. So each national competent authority will have a shortage catalog with that information. If you cannot locate that in the national competent authority of your country, you can look up in the EMA website, where we have a link for each of the shortage catalog in each member state. So we have that available. You can go through the EMA, or you can go directly to the national competent authority.
Okay, thank you, Monica. And I think we have another question to come up now as well. Patients are at the end of the supply chain. You should have some more point of alarm to detect and prevent the problem. And I think Piera, you touched on this as well. Is that it? And I suppose Monica, you did as well. It's about communicating and it's about supply. But maybe if you wanted to answer that question, or
yes, perhaps I can. You want to start, Piera?
Oh no, you can start, because first of all we need central activity from EMA, for example, to resolve the big problems at the beginning of the supply chain. So you can start, and then I will add some suggestion for the patients.
So indeed, you know, the patients at the end of the supply chain, and the problems need to be detected much earlier. And that's why the task force has issued a guidance for MAHs, so for the marketing authorization holders, on the detection and notification of shortages. So we developed this guidance that also includes, for the first time, a definition of shortage. So this has been always very controversial, because companies argue that they didn't know when or how to report shortages, because there was not a common definition in the EU. So now we have a definition of shortage. So this is when the supply does not meet the demand at national level. And when that happens, MAHs need to inform national competent authorities. And that has to be done as early as possible, and even 2 months in advance of that particular shortage. And why do we want to have early notification? We need to, national competent authorities, regulators need to know this as early as possible, and long before the shortage is actually occurring, so that we can prevent shortages. If we are aware of a shortage, an anticipated shortage by a pharmaceutical company, we can see what alternatives are there in the market. We can contact the alternative companies and see whether they can increase the production and can supply to replace that shortfall from that particular company that cannot supply the market. But that information needs to be available to regulators as early as possible. So we need to have early notification from pharmaceutical companies. So indeed, the situation should not be resolved at a point that the patient actually doesn't have a medicine and notifies regulators at that point in time, and then we start actually managing that shortage. It should be much earlier. So we're focusing very much in prevention of shortages, and that's why we're developing the concept paper on prevention of shortages. We need to focus on prevention. Of course, it's important to mitigate the shortage once it's already there. Of course, we need to, but most importantly, we focus on prevention.
And I think that makes 100% sense, except when you look at COVID, because it moves so quickly, and it was outside somewhat of our control, our prediction of trying to prevent it as much as possible.
Yes, and you refer to the situation going to the pharmacy and the medicines not being available. So we also had shortages during the COVID COVID pandemic, because it happened in many cases that the clinicians were prescribing for longer periods, so that the patients didn't have to go to the pharmacy, let's say, for 3 months. Now, pharmaceutical companies were not expecting that increase in demands so quickly, and so that there were situations there where there were shortages, because of course it was difficult to anticipate the situation. I think it was the first time that ever we had lockdowns in Europe, and we all these restrictions to movement of people. So it was, I think, a unique situation that we tried as much as possible to handle the best way to minimize the consequences for patients.
And I think we all hope it was a unique situation, but I think we probably, all organizations and associations, have learned a lot from it to be prepared as much as we can be. Piera, did you want to answer that? Sorry, as well. Did you want to comment?
Yes, only what I told you before, that is very important in this situation that the patient get their medication in advance. So 2 weeks in the pandemic situation, 3 weeks before, because they need to have the time to speak with their doctors. In case of shortages, the physician can suggest a possible alternative, but this takes time. So it's important to not restock the medication 2 days before they complete the medicines, the therapy.
So we have another question. Has COVID affected the way medicines are evaluated?
No,
I don't know who wants to answer that.
No, I can answer that. No, that it has not changed. It has not changed the way medicines are evaluated. What we've put in place, of course, was this accelerated review for procedures in the context of COVID, and also as well to prevent shortages. We, of course, can accelerate the procedure itself to make sure that the medicines are available quicker to patients, but there is no difference in the way, as I mentioned, the robustness of the system is fully kept. So there are no other changes on how the medicines are evaluated. No.
Okay, and there we have a question. EMA has a program to bring medicines closer to patients, avoiding trips to hospitals.
Well, I think this is perhaps linked with the previous question on having different pharmaceutical forms authorized for a particular medicine to avoid visits to hospital and making sure that patients can be treated in a home setting. We as an agency, as I mentioned, we cannot take that initiative as such. So this has to be triggered by the pharmaceutical company. So they have to submit, if they don't have already an authorization for a particular pharmaceutical form, they will have to submit an authorization, and that needs to be assessed very carefully. And again, we look at the benefit risk of that new pharmaceutical form and route of administration, and then we provide an opinion, and we authorize or not that particular pharmaceutical form. But we don't have as such a way to bring medicines from hospitals to the home setting. But we have a way to facilitate, should companies wish to have authorization for different pharmaceutical forms.
And Piera, what do you think? Yeah, what do you think?
In this period of COVID-19, to avoid that the patient need to come frequently in hospital setting to protect them from the infection, we have facilitated the delivery of the drug at home through the Red Cross. In Italy, but I think in all the country, the patient can call the Red Cross to obtain the delivery of the drugs for free. My hospital decided to pay the Red Cross to deliver a lot of drugs to many patients that need to came in my hospital to receive the drugs. In this way, we reduce the access to the hospital, and it was important to avoid possible infection to the patient.
If I may, I can see that we are just running out of the time. There is last few words from my point of view, or I mean, for the patient organization. So I really appreciate your answers, and also I agree that the communication is one important element. And from my point of view and all other patients, it's important even to communicate patient-to-patient organization, because sometimes the patient stands alone, which is not what we want to have, but we want to communicate through patient organization. On the other hand, we need to rely on institutions and authorities. So there is also need for to trust to patient organization, but also to trust authorities and institutions. So the communication triangle can be really strong, and we can do better and better. So this is everything from my point of view. Thank you very much that I have the opportunity to be here.
So I just want to close on behalf of Efcca, Monica and Piera. I know you were both very, very busy during these times. And for our first patient talks, I think we were really very, very, very grateful that you took the time out, and we welcome the contribution, and we hope this will continue. And I think the main key point for me is that communication between organizations is crucial. And so we'd like to thank you very much for your time, for joining us and our members.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.